Hey everyone, welcome to Tony for The Grand Unity. I mean Tony for you. With the arrival of the new Metaphor Re Fantazio, there's so much rich lore to dive into. Many of the themes of the game are mirrored in our world and come from the fundamental study of psychology and mythology. Even in the first few hours of the game, you can tell there's much more to the art and theming than meets the eye. The one thing that jumped out to me immediately was the usage of archetypes. This game's analog to personas in the Persona series or demons in Shin Megami Tensei. These equippable classes add a myriad of new abilities and powers to the player. Once you meet one who embodies the archetype, the aspects of previous heroes who share it will empower you throughout your journey. What many don't know is, these archetypes are based on some of the most interesting writings of one of the world's most influential psychoanalysts, Carl Gustav Jung. Let's dive into the research of old and learn as much as we can about these archetypes, to understand not only this amazing game, but the very world around us. Without any further ado, let's talk about the archetypes of Carl Gustav Jung. The original idea of archetypes originates from one Carl Gustav Jung, one of, if not the most prominent figure in the field of psychology, and referenced countless times in Shin Megami Tensei and Persona itself. First mentioned in one of his most integral works entitled The Red Book. This manuscript was a collection of unpublished works called the Black Books, which is more than a little confusing to keep track of in your head. This Red Book was said to be the central work from which all of Jung's ideas stemmed from. Jung, at the age of 38, experienced a series of hallucinations, both visual and auditory, that he claimed was a confrontation with the unconscious. Initially, he was greatly upset by these hallucinations, saying he was worried he was doing a schizophrenia. An interesting way to phrase it. Ultimately though, he viewed these hallucinations as valuable experiences and in private would even induce them himself in the process of active imagination, writing what he learned from these episodes in the Black Book over many years and ultimately collecting them in the Red Book. It's in this book that we come to understand what Jungian psychology is all about, and the core of the very man himself. From subjects such as the self, the shadow, alchemy, theology, and most importantly for the subject today, the collective unconscious and archetypes. Now, it would be impossible to do justice to the entirety of Jung's collective works in a few years, let alone a single video, so let's go over just the very relevant parts. One of Jung's most influential yet controversial concepts was that of the collective unconscious. Jung posited that the one thing we refuse to admit is that we are dependent upon powers that are beyond our control. The man spent 60 years traveling the world and researched all manner of culture, spirituality, and ancient esoteric beliefs. His most important research was done when studying primitive tribes, as well as attentively maintaining the accounts of those suffering from schizophrenia. Over time, with all that he had learned from others, and even corroborating it with his own hallucinations and meditations, he had begun to notice patterns in the seeming chaos. Subjects repeating themselves with striking regularity. It seemed as though, regardless of physical proximity or culture, there exists a single source within all humans from which they derive their beliefs, stories, and even very way of life. Therefore, it can be understood that there must not only be physical evolution of humanity, carrying on the genetics of our predecessors over hundreds of thousands of years, but also a psychological evolution in much the same way. With this concept, the series of repeating themes and ideas makes a lot more sense. They come from a universal human origin point. With further refinement and research, Jung regarded these repeated patterns as archetypes. There exists a universal understanding and collective idea revolving around certain archetypes. Some of these include the healer, the thief, the hero, the lover, the trickster, and the wise old man. Upon hearing those words, there is a very high likelihood, regardless of nationality, race, or creed, that you imagine something very similar to the vast majority of other humans on this earth. Whether it be Hercules, King Arthur, or Rama from Greek, British, or Hindu mythology respectively, for the hero, a person who rises to the occasion in times of great strife to bring peace and prosperity to the ones he loves. Or when you think of the trickster, figures like Loki in Norse mythology or Anansi from African lore come to mind, those who, by means of outsmarting and misleading, come to find victory for themselves in seemingly unwinnable situations. The concept is not limited to figures, however. Other archetypes include birth and death, and even the creation of the world and the apocalypse. There exists another mode of thinking called tabula rasa, or blank slate. This is the idea that one is not born with any intrinsic thoughts, behaviors, or biases, but rather their surrounding, upbringing, and experiences throughout life shape who they are. With all the research Jung uncovered in his many decades traveling the world, he'd come to find that the tabula rasa theory was completely false, and there was much more to the human mind than your immediate surroundings. If you have studied world religion yourself, I'm sure many of you have wondered why most religions' creation myths are so similar. The need for a supreme good and a supreme evil, and the belief of life after death by way of rewarding good behavior and punishing bad. Carl Jung believed the very ideas were inherited by us since time immemorial. He ultimately stated that the archetypes express themselves through us as they enter our consciousness, appearing as behaviors, beliefs, and masks we use to convey ourselves to the contemporary world around us. They are personalities within us, understood innately from as early as our first breath. No one figure in folklore is a perfect representation of an archetype, but rather that cultures take on it. Some can vary a great deal, but will always adhere to their basic pattern. From the collective unconscious we all share by virtue of being human, we are much more similar than we are different, no matter where we are in the world. Despite everything we learned though, there is the matter of the self, the true self within us, not the masks we use to make our way through the world. Who we really are. Another of Carl Jung's ideas was a take on Sigmund Freud's theory of the id, ego, and superego. This is a structural model by which the human consciousness can be explained. The id is the unconscious, the source by which all of our unknowable instincts derive. A chaotic mess of desire and self-gratification. The superego is the aspect of the mind which reflects the rules and teachings of those around us. Mainly through upbringing and parental guidance, it can easily be understood as our conscience. The ego is the highly logical side, the means by which you can analyze the world around you and synthesize the input into understandable perception. It's also the means by which you can coalesce the information from the superego and the id into the actions you take day by day. So, along with Carl Jung's teachings, we can interpret the id as the shadow of ourselves, the superego as the hero or wizened figure of some sort, and the ego as the persona we use to interact with the world. Even within that neat explanation, there is one last thing. Where does that leave one's true self? The true person behind the mask we use to go about our business. No matter how true and honest you are, you put on airs to a degree. But deep down, you are something more, something even you may not know. When one refers to themselves, they are referring to their hypothetical self, which is covered by the term ego. But there is something more complete than the you in this current state, in this current time. Something you may not even be conscious of. The self in this context is something not easily understood, but in order to achieve true self-actualization, you must look inward and meditate on many things. The world, your place in it, and how you can be the truest you can be. Now, let's explain archetypes as they pertain to Metaphor Re Fantazio. A main theme of the game is being true to oneself, speaking truth to power by quite literally using your heart as a means to shout your convictions to your transgressor. Initially, the idea of the archetype is very similar to the idea of personas from Atlas's previous game series, Persona, but there's much more to it than simply a gameplay analog. According to Jungian psychological theory, archetypes and personas are on the surface very similar, but with one distinct difference. Personas are masks by which we convey ourselves to the outside world, but the self-archetype is who we truly are. All personas are archetypes, but one does not choose their self-archetype. It is who we truly are deep inside. With this knowledge, we can understand the main character and even each of the party members changing their archetypes means they are changing the outward means by which they are conveying themselves to the world. These changes can be interpreted as their persona changing, or the mask they wear, but their true selves are still within. Thematically, this can be interpreted as their stats not particularly being suited for certain roles. Stroll, the big two-handed sword-wielding warrior, is not a good fit for the healer archetype, which stays near the back and heals the party. Yufa, the young religious mage, is not quite a good fit for the brawler archetype, which uses life as a resource to deal devastating physical damage to the enemy. They can switch to these personas at will due to their power, but their true self will always limit them in some ways, boosting them in others. But the game thought of this. In this regard, Metaphor Re Fantazio has an ultimate royal class that can be seen as the given character's true self archetype. After finishing each party member's unique quest, helping them grow as a person and achieve true self-actualization along the way, they can ascend to their strongest and truest form. Fittingly enough, this archetype is the one they start with, the one they reach to in their deepest time of need and scream their will to power with their very own hearts. Hulkenberg's true self is that of a faithful knight whose convictions stand with the protection of others and a life of service. Basilio, in his heart of hearts, is a berserker, ready to unleash hell on anyone who threatens his friends and family. The design of each archetype is easily recognizable, and at first I was a little disappointed in how they don't explicitly reference anything historically or within the realm of mythology. But this also pays homage to Jungian psychology. With the idea of the collective unconscious, each archetype must easily evoke the image of which they are portraying to the world. When one sees the archetype of the warrior, the knight, the commander, and the healer, one can easily understand their general concept and even demeanor. This simplistic design is to the game's benefit, where if they were to pay direct homage to one specific being in mythology or history, it would diminish the pure form of the archetype itself, the true self in its primordial and unmolested state. The true idea of a warrior, the true idea of a mage, and the true idea of a prince. Well, that covers my Intro to Archetypes Psych 101 lecture. Let me know what you thought of the game's take on archetypes in the comments down below, and while you're down there, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I can't overstate how much I like this game, so it should go without saying I think they did a pretty fantastic job. Special thanks to ZZZ, Andre Vinicius da Silva Valens, Arctic Mirror, Kalos, Kerhos, Goose Kebab, Jem Morales, Just a Middleman, Masker2196, Matt M, Patty123, Paul Torrio, The Digital Dutchman, VideoGamer75, and many more for supporting the channel on Patreon. If you'd like to support, check the link in the description below. Thanks for watching this guide to accepting your true self, and I'll see you in the next Tony for You. Have a good one.